the room had fallen silent. Not the kind of silence that comes politely at the end of a speech, but the kind that crashes down like a sudden storm. Cameras froze on faces that couldn't hide their disbelief. Eyes widened, jaws half open, and a tension in the air so sharp it could cut glass. Pam Bondi, once the picture of confidence, sat motionless, her words evaporated, her expression betraying the shock of a fighter who never saw the punch coming. Across from her, Jasmine Crockett leaned back with the poise of someone who knew she had just changed the trajectory of the moment forever. 5 minutes earlier, no one expected it. Bondi had strutted into the exchange with the smirk of someone convinced the spotlight belonged to her. She had interrupted, dismissed, and projected arrogance that felt almost rehearsed. But what unfolded next wasn't scripted. It wasn't staged. It was raw, live, and electric. The kind of confrontation that instantly branded itself into the memory of everyone watching, the audience. Both in the room and beyond the cameras, felt the shift like a seismic tremor. Social feeds exploded within seconds. Hashtags, captions, memes, each one trying to capture the impossible. How? In less than the span of a coffee break, Crockett had managed to silence a figure who had built a career on commanding the mic. Yet in that charged silence, after the final blow landed, it wasn't just Bondi who looked diminished. It was the entire performance of arrogance. The theater of power that had relied for too long on dismissing voices like Crockett's. In that instant, Crockett wasn't just speaking for herself. She was channeling the rage, pride, and dignity of communities who had been told to sit down, hush up, and take their place in the margins. Viewers replayed the clip over and over, not just to savor the takedown, but to feel the validation that dignity can triumph over smugness, that truth can outshine bluster. This wasn't merely a debate. It was a reckoning, compressed into 5 unforgettable minutes. But to understand how Bondi was silenced forever, we need to go back to where the fire first ignited. Before that silence thundered through the room, and before social media erupted in disbelief, the stage had already been set for a collision far bigger than two people trading barbs. This wasn't just about Pam Bondi and Jasmine Crockett. It was about the fault lines in America. Power versus resistance. Privilege versus perseverance. Arrogance versus authenticity. Every second of their exchange carried the weight of these deeper battles. Everyone watching knew it. Pam Bondi didn't walk into that space as a blank slate. She came in cloaked in the aura of establishment privilege. It's a kind that's been shielded by networks of influence and insulated from accountability. Her supporters expected her to dominate. Her detractors braced themselves for another round of smirks and condescension. Either way, she represented the same old brand of politics, polished on the surface, but brittle when tested. Across from her, Jasmine Crockett embodied something entirely different. She wasn't just a congresswoman. She was a symbol of grit, of lived experience, of voices that had been pushed to the sidelines but refused to stay silent. To the progressive-leaning viewers who tuned in, she wasn't just another politician. She was proof that the system could be challenged from within, and that fire, honesty, and intelligence could still cut through the noise. The clash mattered because it wasn't occurring in a vacuum. It happened at a time when debates about identity, justice, and representation weren't just abstract ideas. They were daily battles in communities across the country. Immigrants fighting for dignity, workers fighting for fair wages, families demanding accountability from institutions that had long ignored them. In that setting, Bondi's brand of dismissive arrogance felt like a direct insult, not just to Crockett, but to every person who had ever been underestimated or talked over. The tension was palpable, even before a word was exchanged. You could feel it in the way the cameras lingered on Bondi's confident grin, as if daring anyone to challenge her. You could sense it in Crockett's measured calm, the kind of calm that doesn't come from inexperience but from knowing exactly what's at stake. And make no mistake, what was at stake was monumental. For Bondi, it was her reputation as a seasoned political operator who could outtalk and outmaneuver her critics. For Crockett, it was the chance to not only defend herself, but to stand as a voice for millions who had been written off as background noise. This wasn't about one argument. It was about which story of America would prevail. The story that mocked difference and reveled in entitlement, or the story that embraced diversity, courage, and truth. The cameras rolled, the lights burned, and the audience leaned in. They weren't just waiting for a conversation. They were waiting for a verdict on the kind of leadership America deserved. The stage was set for humiliation on a national scale, yet no one could predict the brutal efficiency of what was about to unfold. Pam Bondi did not arrive at this moment by accident. She had spent years cultivating an image, sharp suits, polished sound bites, and the aura of someone who believed she could bend any room to her will. To her admirers, she was a fighter, a straight shooter who carried the confidence of someone who had stood at the podium countless times before. But behind the shine of television appearances and high-profile cases, a pattern had always lingered, arrogance, selective outrage, and a talent for sidestepping accountability. Bondi rose to prominence as Florida's Attorney General, a role she wielded with the swagger of a politician who understood the power of the camera as much as the power of the law. She built her brand on toughness, especially when it came to grandstanding on issues that played well in headlines. Yet time and again, critics noticed that her toughness often seemed to soften when it came to allies in power. The same sharpness she directed toward vulnerable groups or progressive reforms seemed too dull when the spotlight turned to corruption close to home. It wasn't long before her career became entangled with controversy. Questions swirled about her connections to powerful donors, about whether justice was being served or bartered away. There were whispers of favors and investigations conveniently dropped. Allegations that reinforced the image of someone more interested in optics than in truth. To many, she became the embodiment of what happens when ambition and arrogance intertwine. Someone who could deliver fiery lines on TV, while quietly undercutting the very principles she claimed to uphold. And then there was the personality. The way she carried herself in public debates and interviews. Bondi rarely entered a room without that unmistakable smirk, the look of someone who believed her position was unshakable. Dismissiveness came as easily to her as breathing. She interrupted. She talked over critics. She wielded charm when it suited her, but condescension was her more familiar weapon. For years it had worked. She was used to being the loudest voice, the one who walked away with the last word. By the time she sat across from Jasmine Crockett, Bondi was already a seasoned player in the theater of televised politics. Her allies expected another performance where she would dominate the conversation, reduce her opponent to defensive stammers, and walk away with sound bites replayed in her favor. After all, this was her comfort zone. The cameras, the stage, the belief that confidence alone could substitute for substance. But therein lay the contradiction. For all her experience, for all her practice, Bondi had become too comfortable in the role of the untouchable figure. She underestimated her opponents because she had built her career on dismissing them. She mistook arrogance for strength, forgetting that the same public that once cheered her bluster had grown tired of empty performances. What had once been seen as tough was increasingly being recognized for what it really was, an act of deflection, a shield for hypocrisy. Walking into that confrontation, Bondi believed the script would play out like it always had. She would smirk, interrupt, and drown out the other voice. She would rely on her practiced cadence and cultivated aura of authority. And as always, she thought the audience would reward her bravado. But something was different this time. Across the table sat someone who had not spent a career bending to arrogance. Someone who understood the stakes, not just as politics, but as identity, survival, and truth. Crockett wasn't intimidated by the glare of the lights or the weight of Bondi's resume. She was ready, and more than ready. She was fueled by the countless people who had watched figures like Bondi, dismissed them for years. Bondi believed she had the upper hand, but she underestimated the fire waiting across the table. To understand the power of Jasmine Crockett's words, you have to understand the woman behind them. She didn't emerge onto the national stage polished by privilege or lifted by insider connections. She rose from grit, from resilience, from a lifetime of watching how systems can fail ordinary people. In deciding she would not stand by silently while they did, born and raised in Texas, Crockett's roots were never far from her politics. She grew up in a world where dignity was earned through hard work, where identity was something to be celebrated, not hidden. That foundation shaped the fire she would later bring into the courtroom, and eventually into Congress. It wasn't ambition for ambition's sake that propelled her, it was service. It was the unshakable belief that her community deserved a champion who wouldn't bend under pressure. Before she ever made a headline, Crockett was a lawyer on the front lines of justice. She wasn't chasing corporate paychecks or cozying up to powerful firms. She was defending the voiceless. Criminal defense, civil rights. Cases that other attorneys might dismiss as too messy or too unwinnable. Those were the battles she chose. Every client, every case, every uphill fight built her reputation as a relentless advocate who wouldn't be intimidated. No matter how lopsided the odds, she knew what it meant to stand in a courtroom facing not just the opposing counsel, but an entire system tilted against the people she represented. And in those moments, she learned a lesson that would follow her into politics. Truth carries its own kind of power. You don't always need the most resources, the flashiest credentials, or the loudest voice. You need clarity. You need courage. You need to be willing to speak when others stay quiet. That willingness soon caught attention outside the courtroom. Grassroots activists began to see Crockett as one of their own. A lawyer who wasn't hiding behind legal jargon, but speaking directly to the communities she defended. When protests erupted in the streets, when neighborhoods demanded justice after being ignored for decades, Crockett wasn't on the sideline. She was present. She was visible. and she was unafraid to call out injustice, no matter how entrenched or politically inconvenient it. Her rise to Congress wasn't handed to her. It was fought for, step by step. With the same determination she brought to her cases, she ran not as a polished insider, but as an outsider with the scars to prove she understood the struggles of everyday people. Her campaign didn't drown in platitudes. It thrived on authenticity. She spoke about identity, about pride, about the dignity of immigrant families and marginalized voices that too often went unheard. She didn't just ask for votes. She asked people to see themselves reflected in her story. By the time she entered the halls of power, Crockett had already built a reputation that made her stand out in a sea of soundbites in political theater. She was fearless, unapologetic, unwilling to water down her convictions for the sake of decorum. Where others rehearsed their lines to avoid offense, she spoke with a candor that resonated. She became the voice that said what others were too timid to say. And in an era when so many politicians seemed more concerned with managing their image, Crockett's blunt honesty felt like oxygen. But what truly distinguished her wasn't just her fire, it was her empathy. She didn't speak from theory. She spoke from lived experience and from standing shoulder to shoulder with the people she represented. Every debate, every speech, every televised exchange was an extension of that authenticity. For her, politics wasn't theater. It was personal. That's what made the stage with Pam Bondi so electric. Crockett wasn't merely entering a sparring match. She was carrying the weight of countless struggles. Stories of clients, neighbors, families who had been dismissed and disregarded by systems that claimed to serve them. Where Bondi carried arrogance, Crockett carried authenticity. Where Bondi relied on practiced smirks, Crockett relied on raw conviction. And that conviction, honed through years of standing up for the voiceless, made her unshakable. She knew arrogance when she saw it. She had faced it in courtrooms, in negotiations, in the very halls of power. She had learned that bullies fold when confronted with courage. And when that moment came on live television, Crockett wasn't nervous. She wasn't hesitant. She was ready. She didn't come to perform. She came to represent. And when the cameras rolled, Crockett carried not just her own voice, but the voices of millions who had been silenced. The tension didn't creep in. It slammed into the room like a drumbeat. From the first exchange, Pam Bondi's strategy was clear. She smirked, she interrupted, she wielded her voice like a weapon, raising it just enough to force attention back onto herself. Every time Crockett began to speak, Bondi's interjections came sharp and calculated, designed not to add substance, but to rattle. Bondi leaned back in her chair with the casual arrogance of someone who believed the cameras were her allies. She tossed barbed comments with an ease that revealed just how many times she had rehearsed this role. The condescending veteran facing down the so-called newcomer, her smirk lingered even when the words didn't land. For years, that expression had been enough to tilt the balance, to create the illusion of control. But Crockett didn't flinch. She sat poised, her hands steady, her expression measured. Where Bondi threw heat, Crockett exuded calm. And it was that calmness that began to draw the room's attention away from Bondi's theatrics and toward the growing weight of what was about to happen. The interruptions mounted. Bondi cut in mid-sentence, rolled her eyes, even chuckled dismissively at points that demanded seriousness. The audience shifted in their seats. A few raised eyebrows betrayed discomfort. A subtle gasp broke through when Bondi launched one jab too many, mocking not just Crockett's position, but her very right to be in the space. That was the moment the energy shifted. Crockett didn't snap back. She didn't mirror the arrogance. Instead, she let the pause hang, an intentional silence that spoke louder than any retort. Her calm was no longer just composure, it was strategy, and the audience felt it. Bondi's overconfidence was starting to look less like dominance and more like desperation. The cameras caught it all. The close-ups revealed Bondi's smirk hardening, her eyes darting as Crockett absorbed every insult with a steadiness that unsettled her. Viewers at home felt it too, that growing imbalance between arrogance and authenticity. The more Bondi pushed, the more she revealed her own insecurity. And Crockett, she waited. She timed her responses with surgical precision, choosing not to interrupt but to build pressure. Each calm acknowledgement, each pointed glance, each steady breath pulled the spotlight further away from Bondi's performance and closer to the inevitability of what was coming. In that clash, Q could feel the archetypes colliding. Bondi was the establishment voice, clinging to the tricks that had carried her through before. Crockett was the disruptor, refusing to play by those rules, embodying the quiet confidence of someone who had been underestimated. Too many times to count, the room began to sense it, the unraveling of a script Bondi thought she controlled. Viewers leaned closer to their screens. Was Crockett simply absorbing this barrage, or was she setting the stage for something far more devastating? Then Crockett leaned forward, her eyes locked, and the room knew the takedown was about to begin. The moment Crockett leaned forward, the temperature in the room changed. Gone was the passive calm. In its place emerged a laser focus, the kind that told everyone watching, this wasn't going to be another sparring match. This was going to be a dismantling. She began not with fire, but with precision. Her voice was steady, her tone measured, as if she were laying down bricks one by one. Each statement was anchored, in fact, delivered with the cadence of someone who had rehearsed nothing, but lived everything. Bondi tried to cut in again, but Crockett didn't flinch. She held her ground, her voice carrying over Bondi's interruption with the force of inevitability. The first blow landed quietly, an undeniable contradiction in Bondi's record that left her visibly unsettled. Crockett didn't gloat. She simply let the facts breathe. The audience reacted with a murmur, kind of collective shift that signaled they were no longer buying what Bondi was selling. Then came the escalation. Crockett quickened her rhythm, layering evidence upon evidence, weaving logic with lived truth. She exposed Bondi's hypocrisy, not with shouting, but with clarity that cut deeper than volume ever could. Every line carried weight, each one stacking on the last, until Bondi's smirk began to falter. And then the one-liners. Devastating, surgical, impossible to deflect. Crockett wielded them like a blade, slicing through Bondi's bravado with surgical accuracy. One landed so cleanly that the audience audibly gasped, the sound echoing through the room. Bondi's eyes darted toward the cameras, searching for refuge, but there was none. Crockett pressed on, her confidence swelling not from ego but from purpose. She wasn't grandstanding. She was channeling. Every word carried the weight of those who had been dismissed, interrupted, belittled. The rhythm of her speech was musical. Build, pause, strike, build, pause, strike. Each pause gave the audience a moment to absorb. Each strike left Bondi smaller than before. Bondi tried once more to regain control, interrupting mid-sentence with a desperate laugh, but Crockett didn't give her the satisfaction. She turned her gaze directly on Bondi, her tone dropping lower, sharper. The words that followed weren't just rebuttals. They were indictments spoken with the authority of lived truth. The laugh died in Bondi's throat. The crescendo came as Crockett tied it all together. Her legal background, her community's struggles, the hypocrisy of Bondi's arrogance. She reframed the entire confrontation, making it clear that this wasn't about two women sparring. It was about the clash between arrogance and authenticity, between showmanship and substance. And then the final line. It was delivered with the calm of a verdict, the kind of closing statement that leaves no room for rebuttal. It wasn't loud. It wasn't theatrical. It was quiet, sharp, undeniable. When she delivered her final line, Bondi froze. The silence that followed was louder than any applause. The silence that swallowed the room lasted only seconds, but its echo spread across the nation in waves. By the time the broadcast cut to commercial, phones were already buzzing. Clips of Crockett's dismantling of Bondi were uploaded, clipped, subtitled, and shared at light speed. Within minutes, hashtags like #silenced, #Crockett takedown, #receipts over smirks trended across platforms. Twitter lit up with disbelief and celebration. One user wrote, "Pam Bondi's arrogance just met its match." Jasmine Crockett didn't debate, she delivered justice. Another captioned the viral clip with 5 minutes that will be studied for 5 years. Retweets piled into the hundreds of thousands. The rhythm of the internet had changed. Every scroll revealed a new meme, a new angle, a new declaration that people had just witnessed something historic. On Instagram, Reels replayed Crockett's one-liners again and again, each one punctuated by captions in bold fonts. Dignity over arrogance, facts over smirks. TikTok stitched reactions from young viewers, mouths dropping open, screams of joy, friends high-fiving as if they were in the room themselves. For Gen Z and millennials alike, the clip wasn't just entertaining, it was empowering. It was validation that voices like theirs didn't have to be drowned out by establishment arrogance. Then came the pundits. On cable news, anchors played the segment on loop. Analysts dissected Crockett's composure, her rhetorical precision, the way she turned Bondi's own tactics against her. Conservative commentators scrambled to downplay it, but their strained defenses only highlighted the undeniable. Crockett had landed a knockout. Progressive commentators, meanwhile, called it a masterclass in restraint and retaliation. Late-night hosts couldn't resist either. One played Bondi's frozen expression on repeat, comparing it to a Wi-Fi signal dropping mid-sentence. Another joked, "Pam Bondi walked in with a smirk and walked out with a silence so loud it broke the internet." But it wasn't just media insiders. Celebrities joined in. Musicians tweeted lines of Crockett's speech like lyrics. Activists praised her as the truth-teller we've been waiting for. Even athletes posted clips with captions like, "This is how you finish the game in the fourth quarter." The ripple effect was undeniable. Crockett had not only won a debate, She had created a cultural moment, yet the energy wasn't just celebratory, it was galvanizing. Grassroots groups began sharing the clip as proof that arrogance can be confronted and defeated. Comment sections filled with people saying they felt seen, represented, vindicated. Parents showed the video to their kids. Teachers played it in classrooms. It wasn't just a political moment, it was an identity moment. And still, beneath the laughter and the memes, something deeper stirred. People weren't just thrilled by the takedown, they were inspired by what it symbolized. The silence of Bondi was more than a personal humiliation. It was a mirror held up to a country that had too often allowed its arrogance to dominate and drown out dignity. But the true power of Crockett's takedown wasn't in the memes. It was in the deeper message that cut across America. As the dust settled from the viral storm, one truth became undeniable. Jasmine Crockett's takedown of Pam Bondi was never just about one woman besting another in a televised clash. It was about reframing the entire conversation, about what kind of voices deserve to lead, what kind of values deserve to guide, and what kind of America people want to claim as their own. Crockett's composure in the face of Bondi's arrogance spoke volumes. She didn't meet smirks with smirks or insults with insults. She met them with dignity, and in doing so, she reminded the country that dignity is not weakness. Dignity is strength. It is the ability to absorb contempt without losing composure, to turn disrespect into an opportunity to show what true leadership looks like. Service over self-interest. That theme rang through her words, even beyond the viral clip. Crockett's entire career, from the courtroom to Congress, was a living argument against the kind of politics Bondi embodied. Where Bondi had too often served herself, Crockett's fire came from serving others. That difference was stark, and in the contrast, viewers saw not just to politicians, but to Americas, one clinging to privilege and entitlement, the other lifting up communities with courage and authenticity. Crockett's takedown revealed something deeper about courage itself. True courage doesn't strut into a room, assuming it already holds the upper hand. True courage is born from being underestimated, from being told you don't belong, from standing your ground when the deck is stacked against you. Crockett embodied that. She didn't demand respect with arrogance. She commanded it with truth, and that truth exposed corruption for what it was. A fragile facade that collapses the moment someone dares to confront it head-on. For millions watching, the lesson resonated beyond politics. It became a parable for classrooms, workplaces, and kitchen table conversation. Dignity over arrogance. Service over self-interest. Courage over corruption. These weren't just slogans. They were survival codes for a nation struggling to redefine itself. And perhaps that's why the moment felt so transformative. Because it wasn't really about Pam Bondi being silenced. It was about people seeing themselves in Crockett's resolve. Immigrant families who had been mocked or dismissed saw validation. Communities long told to wait their turn saw a reminder that their time was now. Young people, often accused of being too idealistic, saw proof that idealism, when rooted in truth, can dismantle arrogance brick by brick. The moral was simple, yet profound. Arrogance can win airtime, but it cannot withstand authenticity. Smirks may dominate headlines for a day, but dignity leaves an imprint on history. And when Crockett delivered her final blow, the silence that followed wasn't just the absence of Bondi's voice. It was the presence of a new standard, one that demanded politics be measured not by who can shout the loudest, but by who can stand the tallest in truth. The story of that takedown became more than a trending topic. It became a reflection of democratic values themselves. Democracy thrives when voices once silenced rise up. Representation matters when leaders bring lived experience, not rehearsed arrogance, to the table. And dignity, when wielded with courage, has the power to disarm even the most polished pretenders to power. And in that moment, it wasn't just Pam Bondi who was silenced. It was every voice that tried to drown out the truth. Pam Bondi walked into that room with the confidence of someone who believed she could not be touched. She left with something far heavier, the silence that follows when arrogance collapses under the weight of truth. That is why the world remembers this, not as another political spat, but as the night Pam Bondi was silenced forever. But to see it only as a single debate moment would be to miss the deeper meaning. What Jasmine Crockett delivered was not just a takedown, it was a turning point. It was proof that arrogance, no matter how polished, can be dismantled. Proof that dignity, courage, and authenticity still have the power to command a room and shift the national conversation. Proof that the voices once silenced can now stand center stage. Unapologetic ally. And here's the part that matters most. This moment doesn't belong only to Crockett. It belongs to everyone who has ever been dismissed, interrupted, talked over, or told they weren't enough. It belongs to immigrants who built lives in the face of contempt, to families who kept fighting despite being ignored, to young leaders rising up in spaces that once excluded them. It belongs to you. If you felt the power of that silence, If you saw yourself in Crockett's fire, then this is your invitation. Don't just watch. Be part of the movement that chooses truth over arrogance, service over self-interest, dignity over mockery. Subscribe, share, carry this story forward. Because every time you amplify moments like these, you strengthen the belief that arrogance will not define us. Dignity will, and together, we'll make sure that when arrogance speaks, it doesn't linger. It falls silent, forever.